Salams from the People's Dispatch studios here in New Delhi. I'm Siddhant Aini, and as always, you're watching the Daily Debrief, where we go beyond the headlines on some of the most important news stories from around the world. Today, we're talking about price caps on Russian oil and derivative products and the kind of impact they've had on the global economy, on the Russian economy particularly, as well as the economies of the European Union and other countries, since the G7 decided to unilaterally impose caps on the prices of Russian imports. We also talk about public health from the perspective of negotiations on a new free trade agreement between India and the United Kingdom. India is, of course, one of the largest producers of generic drugs as well as vaccines in the world, known as the pharmacy of the developing world. The country produces as much as, in some cases, 60% of global vaccines. And now, under the negotiations, the United Kingdom is asking for certain intellectual properties and patents to be included in discussions or concessions on those aspects to be given. And Josna Singh from the Public Health Movement will be with us to discuss that. But first up, we're talking to Prabir Purkayastha on the energy situation based on what global media now, including mainstream media, the likes of CNBC, The Economist and others, are calling a complete failure designed by bureaucrats with finance degrees but very little understanding of how global oil markets work. We're talking about the $60 cap that the US and its allies have imposed on the import of Russian crude oil and, of course, then derivative products as well as refined petroleum products. Prabir has been covering the energy markets as well as the impact that the Russia-Ukraine war has had on the economy of the European Union and other countries since the outbreak of the war and the subsequent imposition of sanctions. We go to Prabir now. Prabir, good to have you back on Daily Debrief with us. The big story today, we're talking about the sanctions and related caps on Russian oil and related products, particularly put in place by the European Union, the G7 countries, and the kind of impact that they've had in the context of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. How do you see it? Even the likes of sort of market analysts writing on websites and news outlets like CNBC are saying that the caps have been largely inconsequential and created by bureaucrats with finance degrees, sure, maybe, but with very little understanding of how oil markets work. You are someone who understands how these energy markets, oil markets work. Give us a sense of what's going on in the context of Russia and the various other countries who are involved in trading with them.
You know, the question again is, the world needs a certain amount of energy. And in this, of course, oil, various forms of it, including diesel, which is the processed products, fuel oil, naphtha as feedstock for the fertilizer industry, for example, or, of course, the crude oil itself. These are all products which are available in the market for buying and selling. Now, energy needs are relatively not possible to change. That means you can't change from oil in a day to something else. You can switch certain amount, but not really much. And particularly when you're looking at a whole bunch of subsidiary products which are made from, say, naphtha, for example, fertilizers, and so on, then you don't really have much of flexibility in any case. Or, for instance, the use of diesel in cars, automobiles in various countries. So there is that lack of flexibility on the consumer side. Therefore, to say we will really put a cap as G7, and they probably have about 20-25% of the world's consumption, certainly not more than that they can decide the price of any country's output and say, we will limit you to X. Others can rely on the market, but you cannot get more than X, is something which, as people have said, maybe with finance degrees you believe it will work. It doesn't. Why doesn't it work? Because they believed that they had the ability to control this flows because they have the shipping industry with them, the ship liners, most of them, tankers, most of them will be with them, and they will obey whatever the G7 says. And the second, the insurance companies, those who insure and that's an important issue, the insurance,
Absolutely.
then they are essentially in the European Union and UK. These are the two places most of these companies are, and of course in the United States. UK plays a very big role over here. So the belief is the insurance companies, once they refuse to give insurance, the tankers will not then use Russian crude. So this is the indirect way of really imposing sanctions, thinking the insurance companies and the shipping companies will not take on board if there is a sanction by the G7, because the shipping companies will be targeted, they have a much larger stake, and again, the insurance companies will be targeted, or they will be willing to be a party to the sanctions. Now, this assumes that they haven't looked at what Iran has done for the last 10, 15, 20 years, even more. They have been supplying oil to the market. They have built up a shipping fleet, or they have supported the shipping fleet with help of companies like China, who wanted cheaper Iranian oil. And they have been able to therefore ensure that Iran supplies go freely to China, and they are not touched by any of the insurance companies or any tankers owned by companies which could be open to the US-EU sanctions. Given that history, that they didn't really register that, they have also not been able to therefore not see that Russia is easily able to circumvent it. After all, if countries of the size of India, China, Turkey, for example, are willing to play ball, then it is very unlikely that there will be not enough ships or insurance companies to support that, because these are big economies. They also have ability to give their own insurance guarantees. Banking transactions can be done in different ways. So this whole argument that they could actually they will be able to control the consumption side, not the production. Obviously, Russia will not accept what they're doing. The consumption side, that did not succeed, because the first set of sanctions was $60 a barrel of crude. And that was, I think, done in December, a certain date. You can check up the date. That was done in December. So in 2 months already, by February, as you have said, various reports in the newspapers, organizations, television, etc., said, well, this is not working. Okay, Russians have been able to beat it. There is a whole ghost fleet which has come up, which is able to service what is happening. And Russia has cut back by 500,000 barrels. They want to hold the price. And after the OPEC further cuts in order to maintain the price, if not raise it, they have also imposed another 500 barrel cut. But the issue for Russia is anything above $42, $40, they make a profit. So $60 already gives them a profit. So they have said, anybody trying to use sanctions, we will not supply oil to them. That hits European Union. Yeah. It, of course, doesn't hit the United States because they're self-sufficient in oil and LNG, but it hits Japan. So the first thing that happened is Japan was given an exemption. Okay, you can do it because you're very close to the oil fields that Russia has on its eastern islands, Sakhalin 1, 2, and Sakhalin 1, 2, and so on. Okay, you can continue, we'll give you an exemption. So if we look at European Union, they seem to be committing economic harakiri, we don't know why. As you know, they're the ones who are so dependent on Russian gas. They have now switched to LNG, and much more expensive LNG from United States as well as West Asia. They are also disengaging from oil from Russia, both from pipeline as well as import oil from ships. Yeah. Pipeline oil still is not under sanctions technically, I think. But certainly barrels shipping, those sanctions are operative. And anyway, there is not much oil they're getting, the European Union is getting from Russia these days. So given that, European Union is the one which is really taking a huge hit. It already has and is continuing to take a huge hit. The other economies which are expected to also obey the sanctions, like Mexico, like Japan, are not they're not obeying the sanctions or trying to work out special provisos for themselves, as Japan has done, for example. So given that, how much of this can the United States and its allies impose as G7 on the world seems to be limited. If one of the G7 countries, Japan, is not willing to buy it or not willing to go along with it, and Mexico, which has such a huge trading relationship with the United States, is already saying that we don't think these things work. These things are workable. And while they're not explicitly saying we'll not obey the sanctions, but they seem to be working around it. So given all of this, yes, that this is not practicable, it will not work, because at the end of it, economies, if they need oil, if they need gas, LNG, they will get it. And it's a question of what price they're going to get it. Russia is willing to go ahead with the flexibility of price, provided you do not say you are on the side of the sanctioners and that you are not obeying price, you're obeying the price caps. If you say that, all bets are off. So given this, I think it's a situation where the United States and its allies really have not got off the sanctions bandwagon. They started with financial sanctions, seizing Russian oil, Russian reserves, and then they have continued with various kinds of sanctions. And now with sanctions on the crude oil and products, crude oil derivative products. And I think none of this is really working or likely to work.
All right. Thanks very much, Prabir, for that and for your time today. Our second and final story of the day covers the ongoing free trade agreement negotiations between India and the United Kingdom. This is the 8th round of negotiations between the two countries, leading up to what is potentially a new free trade agreement. Now, the mainstream media has covered a great deal of these negotiations, looking at legal services, exchange of people, and other aspects of negotiations, but very little has been said on the subject of public health from the perspective of intellectual property, which the West, of course, views as intellectual property rights. India has traditionally been against barriers created by codifying these intellectual property rights through patent processes. But now, in these negotiations with other countries for free trade agreements, some exemption discussions have come up. Jyotsna Singh of the People's Health Movement joins us via video conference. She has all the details on this story. Jyotsna, good to have you on Daily Debrief with us this afternoon. A lot has been reported and written on the ongoing negotiations between India and the United Kingdom on this proposed sort of free trade agreement, free trade format. But an area that hasn't been covered so much by the mainstream media is the impact it will have on health, on the health sector, and particularly on public health. Resources and how those things are deployed. What are the kind of concessions that the UK is looking for in terms of intellectual property that are particularly concerning to you?
Yes. So India is negotiating this FTA with the United Kingdom. And as has been the case with all the other free trade agreements that India has negotiated, like either with one country or a multiplicity of countries, the one issue has always been something that the developed countries have asked for in terms of concessions from India, and that is a change in laws regarding intellectual property. So Indian Patents Act, it is something which has, even though it got amended in 2005 in India, again because of pressures of international trade, but there were certain clauses that were retained, which were very important to safeguard public health. Whereas if you look at the way it works in developed countries and many other nations, unfortunately, intellectual property is called rights, which is like you create barriers in access to medicines and ensure that the business benefits from it. But India has certain clauses. And if I can just mention a couple of them, for example, Section 3D, which says that a same medicine, a new form of the same medicine cannot be patented again and again in India. In many other countries, you will be really surprised. It is allowed. In the US, it is allowed. We also have an understanding that if the same medicine is to be used for some other disease, again, the patent should not be granted. Again, in many countries, that happens.
This is what in popular language is referred to as generic drugs. Am I right?
That is right. So, I mean, no, these are patented medicines, and but if it is not patented,
right,
then the generic manufacturers
right,
can produce the medicines, and that helps one, in bringing the prices down, which is because there are many companies which would be making the same medicine,
Absolutely.
but also in terms of availability, because when it is patented, only one company is making the medicine versus many companies making the medicine. So all of this is there. What UK is asking for is change in these very laws, and saying that India should actually has to incorporate data exclusivity, which is the data that is with the company, which becomes very useful for the generic manufacturers when they have to launch or produce the same medicine. It is also saying that the section 3D should be given away. It is also saying that the patent term should be extended beyond 20 years. We already give 20 years to companies after they file the patent. So they want it to be extended more. Now, a very big problem with all of this is that if India agrees to even one country in these FTAs, even if in one FTA a country is able to push India to accept any of these terms,
Hmm.
it will change India's laws, and all the companies across the world will get benefited. It is not vis-a-vis one country at the end of the day. So the kind of pressure India is facing at the moment in terms of lowering its patent uh, public health safeguards and not agreeing to certain patent terms is huge, because all the other FTAs also have some of these concessions that are being asked for.
Possible.
So Indian government should be pushing back, and I think that is a huge task for the international activist community also, to not let this happen, because otherwise we will literally lose what India is called the pharmacy of the developing world. We'll
Right.
lose that
Yeah.
because we won't be able to produce the medicines cheap.
Exactly what I was going to ask you next. Given and in in India's year as holding the presidency of the G20, we've heard a lot from the Prime Minister talking about the kind of work that is being done in this sector, and how India is the pharmacy of the developing world and all of that. So in that context, and also India taking a leading stand at the WTO in regards to TRIPS waivers for the COVID-19 vaccine, of course. Uh, in all with all of this context, Jyotsna, on the political front, what are you hearing? What is India's stand likely to be in regards to this, and how will it go forward?
So if you see, India's stand in international forums has always been, as what you said, where we keep saying we should have less intellectual property barriers, and that has been appreciated. The problem is, on the home front, the way things are happening is exactly the opposite, and which is a huge cause of worry. Because, for example, in Kerala High Court, there was a petition which asked for a compulsory license, which means taking away monopoly of one company on a drug, and where the government, the court was requested that please grant a compulsory license so that other Indian companies can manufacture a breast cancer drug called trastuzumab. When the Indian government is also a party in that petition, of course, they went and they said we do not need it, because breast cancer is not actually an emergency in India. And you would see that next day all the health activists were putting all the numbers of breast cancer patients in the country, and they are registered patients, right? There would be a lot more. These are in one sense a bit confusing signals also, because the international stand that you take, and you gain so much of goodwill of countries and civil society, but on your home front, you're doing exactly the opposite. We do need that. There's so many other drugs which should be given compulsory licensing by India in today's times, in the field of TB, in the field of rare diseases. I mean, there's one medicine which costs 2 crores to treat. Why will we not have a compulsory license on that? Which company can be allowed to make that? We are
Yeah.
not getting that the benefits in India from the Indian government. So I think that should happen. When we ask for TRIPS waiver, our laws allow a lot of those things to happen, like compulsory licensing. We should be granting them. It didn't even happen with remdesivir during COVID, when
Yeah.
people were literally dying left, right, and
Dying.
center. So it's a tricky thing, and we can just hope that the same stand is taken on both the sides, like a better stand. And so the Indian government should do the same at the home front
At the
also.
home front as well. Well, thanks very much, Josna, for putting that into actually quite interesting perspective and also giving our wider audience a sense of how this might impact, countries outside of India and consumers also outside of India who are in need of often life-saving medicines, whether the government considers it so or not. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks for calling me.
And with that, we wrap up this episode of the Daily Debrief. We'll be back actually with you after a day's break on Thursday. Until then, we invite you, as always, to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for more details on these stories and all of the other work we do. We also encourage you to follow us on the social media platform of your choice. Do write in and tell us what you like about the show, your thoughts on the subjects we cover, and the other stories that you might be interested in hearing from us. Thanks very much for watching. We'll see you again. Goodbye.